Thank you, Soon, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming today. They didn't tell me when I was making my slides that I'd be following somebody who worked in animation at Disney. You won't have trouble telling which of us has been a management consultant for the past 15 years. And speaking of having a 4-year-old daughter, I've seen that episode of Sophia First, the first at least 3 times. I know it very, very well. Anyway, I was excited to come here today because the theme of this entire conference is one that I believe very deeply in. It's this idea that research needs to have a voice at the executive table. I've reframed that slightly in my title, which is to say that the customer actually needs a voice at the executive table or within the C-suite, but obviously research as the conduit of the customer's voice would play the major role in that. The reason I believe in this is because I spend almost every day working with CEOs and other senior executives, typically at very large organizations that are undergoing tumultuous industry change, helping them to develop strategies to respond to that change. And I can tell you with certainty that it's the customer perspective that provides the kind of foundational compass for how to respond to industry change. And I would even say that giving the customer a voice at the executive table is too weak of a statement. I think it should be the primary voice and so strong that it drives leadership thinking, leadership decision-making, strategy, and even that it permeates the culture of the entire organization in the ideal world. But that's often not the case. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is why that's so. And most importantly, what can you all do to enable your organizations to enable that voice of the customer within the C-suite and within the leadership decisions? And because I'm a management consultant, I'll start with the answer. I don't have a map like Francis did to lay out where you're going to laugh and things like that. But I will give you an overview of the 3 messages that I really would like you to take away today. The first thing that I would advise you all to do is to teach leaders to have the right frame of reference for defining the business that they're in. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. The second thing that you can do is create a common language for people in your organization so that they can understand each other when they're talking about the customer and customer insights. And the last thing that you can do is enable what we call a jobs-focused organization. And I'll describe in some detail what we mean by that. But these are the 3 ideas that I'm going to be talking about. So let's start with the first one, teaching leaders the right frame of reference. Well, if you're going to aspire to giving the customer a voice around the executive table, a good first thing to try to do would be to understand, who are these executives that are sitting around the table? You're all market researchers. So consider for a moment that a CEO is the subject of your market research. And let's just pick on CEOs for a second, but this really applies to leaders at many levels in an organization. So what type of creatures are CEOs? What do they worry about? How do they spend their time? What are their problems? Well, they worry about a lot of things. They worry about, obviously, performance. They worry about hitting the goals that they've committed their organizations to hitting. They worry about their competition, they worry about their customers, they worry a lot about their people that work in their companies, and they worry about culture. And they also worry about figuring out what it is they ought to be worrying about. And that's the thing that I like to focus on now via a little thought exercise. So imagine that you are a CEO for a moment. Imagine that you're the CEO of Marriott, hotel chain, very, very successful global chain that has a whole variety of brands within the hotel business. And you see Airbnb pop up over a couple of years. And within 2 years, this company that's built on this premise that people are going to share their spare space in their homes has a larger valuation than Marriott by a fair amount. How worried would you be if you were the CEO of Marriott about Airbnb? What if you're the CEO of General Motors? You've been selling cars and trucks for 100 years, and you wake up one morning and you realize that Google is now launching self-driving cars that are already tooling around California. How worried would you be about that? And last example, imagine if you're State Farm, the largest automobile insurance company in the world, one of the largest homeowners insurance companies in the world, and you see a company called Nest that's starting to sell home monitoring devices that are very easy to install in your home. How worried should you be about that? These are the types of things that leaders face all the time. They see things that are happening that don't quite make sense to them. And the question they have is this a threat? Is this an opportunity? Is it a big threat, a big opportunity, or is it something I should ignore? And the answer to the question about how worried you should be is, it's a classic consultant answer, which is that it depends, right? It depends on how you understand and define the business that you're in. If you're Marriott and you define your business as being the hotel business, there's no reason to worry about Airbnb. They're not in the hotel business. If you're GM, you're in the car and truck business, there's no reason to worry about Google. What do they know about making cars and trucks? And similarly for State Farm, if you're in the insurance business, there's no reason for you to worry about Nest. But what I'd like to get across is that that's the wrong frame of reference. And in fact, you can play a big role in leading your organizations and your leaders to adopting the right frame of reference. And I'll illustrate that with a quick story about a company called Doddridge that we worked with a few years ago. Doddridge has been around for over 100 years. They make appliances. They're an Indian company. And about 50 years ago, they introduced refrigerators to India. When we started working with them, they were looking to find ways to grow. And like any good company, they thought about themselves as being in the business of selling highly functional, high-end refrigerators that we might purchase here in the United States. They had a certain cost structure, a certain supply chain, a certain way of servicing these things. And they thought, well, 90% of the people in India don't have a refrigerator. It's primarily a cost barrier. Let's just figure out how we can take our refrigerators, make them smaller, make them cheaper, a little bit fewer features, and then we'll be all set. We can gain quite a bit of penetration that way. And they did something that you would probably recommend they do, which is they went into rural areas and they talked to people that already had refrigerators, and they tried to understand, well, how are you using them? What's important to you? What's not important to you as a guide to designing this kind of scaled-down refrigerator? And they found a few really surprising things. The first was that most of the refrigerators were not even plugged in. The majority of them had never been plugged in. The ones that were not plugged in had things like pots and pans and clothes inside, and they were being used for storage. And the ones that were plugged in maybe had one or two dishes inside, and they would only be plugged in sporadically. So clearly there was something that they didn't understand about the consumer and the nature of the problem they were facing around refrigeration. So they started with a blank piece of paper. They went in and they talked to villagers, and they followed them around and tried to understand, well, how do you consume food? What are your routines and challenges that are associated with preparing and consuming food? And they discovered a bunch of interesting things. The first is that people in rural areas typically buy the food they're going to eat every single day, and they prepare it every day. This is because they're worried about it spoiling, but it's also because they're cost constrained. They can't afford to buy a lot of food at once. And they discovered that really the problem that they needed to solve was not, let's preserve our frozen dinners for all eternity, but rather, all we need to do is just keep milk, vegetables, perishables cool for a day or two so it doesn't go to waste. And that was really the primary job they had, because they were losing about a third of all the food in India gets lost to spoilage. Very different job to be done than we have for our refrigerators. They also found that their routine of going to the market and purchasing food on a daily basis was an important one to them. And so it was an important part of connecting with their family and friends. So they didn't want to lose that entirely. They just didn't want to be forced to do it quite as much, and they didn't want to lose their food. And then finally, there were emotional jobs to be done that they had, which were around conveying prestige and allowing my kids to impress their friends. So they discovered that this was really the nature of the problem that they were trying to solve for, very, very different than their typical customer. And this is the solution they designed. They called it Chotu Kool. It works on a completely different refrigeration technology than our refrigerators do, or than Doddridge's other refrigerators, using a solid-state cooling mechanism that is similar to the types of circuits that are on our computers that cool our computers. It was top-loading, so it was very efficient, so heat wouldn't be lost and wasted, or coolness wouldn't be lost and wasted when we open it from the side. It was portable, it was very light, and it was very inexpensive. Didn't require servicing from an expensive supply chain and servicing network, and looks completely unlike the type of product that we might embrace. And they also had a distribution innovation that they had to come up with because the cost structure associated with their existing distribution was just too high. And they hit on this idea of distributing them through post offices, because every village had a post office. It was often a place that people would convene, and so they would distribute them through post offices. This thing has been wildly successful. It's sold hundreds and hundreds of thousands of units. It's even found a home in shopkeepers. It was a market that they didn't even anticipate, because now it enabled small business owners to offer cool, refreshing beverages, and it's in its third generation. And so the moral of the story, back to my point about having the right frame of reference, is that Doddridge initially had a kind of product business model-centric frame of reference relative to their existing products, existing business models. In order to navigate this new market that they wanted to pursue, they had to frame it around the customer and the customer's problem. And there's a great quote that I'm sure you've all heard by Ted Levitt, this quote that people don't want a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole. People are not actually interested in products and services as ends in and of themselves. We all just have problems that arise in our lives, and when those problems arise, we look around for the best solution to pull into our life to solve it. And this framing of the problem and the customer as the primary way of defining the business that you're in is a critical thing for leaders to embrace, and it's something that you can help them to understand given your own roles. So that's the first point. The second point is this idea of establishing in your organization a common language for people to talk about customers and customer problems. And here, Soon mentioned this idea of jobs to be done. And you probably are all familiar with this to some extent. And the basic idea is that people don't buy products and services, rather they hire them to get important, unsatisfied jobs done in their lives. And the book that we've just written with Clay Christensen is all about this idea of jobs to be done. And in particular, it provides a very precise definition of what we mean by a job. A job is the progress that you or some customer or stakeholder is trying to make within a specific circumstance or context. It has functional, social, emotional dimensions, and it captures the customer's definition of quality. And I'm not going to go into jobs to be done in gory detail, but the reason I'm introducing it here is because I found in my work with leaders that it's an incredibly powerful language for them to easily internalize and then use as a language to talk about customer needs. I know there are lots of methodologies around understanding customer needs, but in terms of a pragmatic, useful language for leaders to understand, that they can easily get their heads around and immediately apply, I've really never seen anything as powerful as this idea of the job to be done. So I recommend it. And then if you use this as the basis for establishing that frame of reference, then it can really provide the blueprint for strategy, for innovation, and for all kinds of other leadership decisions. Just to double-click a bit on the elements of this language, because beyond just the job to be done, we think the definition is important as part of that vocabulary. We say that it's the progress that somebody is aspiring to make. And I've extended this drill example. Perhaps the progress I want to make is I want to create a quarter-inch hole. Maybe I'm a first-time homeowner, and so I haven't been motivated perhaps to ever be that handy. The circumstance that I'm in is critically important. Maybe I'm going to be working on the roof for an extended period of time. And it has functional, social, emotional dimensions. I want it to be fast and easy. Perhaps my social job associated with it is I want to be seen as handy, and I want to feel safe. And it captures the definition of this particular customer in terms of what quality means. I want it to be cheap, and I want it to be good enough. I don't need something that's like professional grade or even feels like it. So just an illustration of the elements of this vocabulary that, again, I found to be very helpful with leaders in getting them to embrace the customer's voice as part of their dialogues. And now I want to just link these first two ideas together, this idea of the language and the frame of reference. Jobs provides a very powerful way to reframe the problems that you're trying to solve from a strategic perspective. So just a quick example, a traditional frame of reference, you might think about getting a cup of coffee as being the problem you're trying to solve for if you're a coffee company. But think about all the different reasons we might hire a cup of coffee, all the different jobs we might have to be done. We might be hiring it just because we want an excuse for an informal chat. Maybe I'm at a social gathering and I want to avoid feeling awkward, so I pick up a cup of coffee. I hire that cup of coffee. Maybe I just want to stay awake and energized because I have work to do. These are all equally viable candidates for a job to be done for which somebody might hire a cup of coffee. And the important thing is that if you then frame the problem you're trying to solve for in your innovation or strategy through the lens of the job, it completely changes a whole range of things. It changes who you view as the competition, right? If you frame it through the lens of the product, getting a cup of coffee, then you're going to be competing with other providers of coffee, Starbucks, McDonald's, self-managed machines. If the job is, in fact, give me an excuse for an informal chat, you're going to have a completely different set of competitors. Dinner, going to a bar, having a picnic. I'm not sure how many of us have picnics when we want to have formal chats, but that's what's on the slide. And it redefines the market within which you're competing, right? The growth potential, if you're framing the problem as a coffee product-centric problem, is constrained by the total sales of coffee or the total beverage consumption, whereas these other things, the market potential is typically much, much larger. The avenues you have for innovation are much more constrained in one case versus the other. And it also clarifies, what trends that are emerging that you should be worried about. So jobs to be done as a language, a thought process, is a very helpful way to work with executives to frame their business in the right way and give that customer a voice. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is this idea of enabling a jobs-focused organization. So if everything I just said makes sense and sounds good, well, why isn't everybody doing it? Well, if you look at the origin stories of most companies, of every company, I would hypothesize, when they started out, whether they knew it or not, in order to get any traction in some market with some group of customers, they had to have created something that addressed somebody's important, unsatisfied job better than any other option. In our view, that's literally the only way you would get traction in a market at the beginning. And that's what drove their early success, and typically young companies think about themselves as being in the business of solving certain types of problems. But then a set of forces kind of take hold as they scale, as they start to organize themselves to scale. They start to organize themselves around product categories and develop processes to create those products ever more efficiently. They start to measure their success in the market in terms of sales of those products. They start to get evaluated by analysts, by their shareholders, relative to other companies that are selling those same products. They define success in terms of their market share for those products. They gather data about those products, and they ultimately develop strategies for the future that are about preserving or extending share in those products or moving perhaps into adjacent areas. And all of these things force them into this kind of product-centric way of looking at the world. and they start to think about themselves as being a product company, a drill company in this example, as opposed to a company that exists to create quarter-inch holes. And this happens as part of the natural life cycle of companies. And the question is, what can you do about that? So I have one last story just to illustrate an organization that was able to overcome that tendency of companies to frame their business in the wrong way and organize in the wrong way. And this is an example of Southern New Hampshire University. Most of you have heard about this because they're pretty prevalent in advertising. Back in 1932, they were just a sleepy, local college in New Hampshire with about 3,000 students. Today, they have over 100,000 students. They're one of the fastest growing universities in the world, and they make about $600 million a year, which is incredible. They did it by embracing this idea of understanding the jobs to be done, and then creating an organization that could deliver against those jobs to be done. This is a picture of Paul LeBlanc, who really drove this transformation. He's an incredible person, very inspiring. And when he took the reins at Southern New Hampshire University, he looked at the current offering, the current business they had, and it was fairly generic, multi-subject education, and kind of a one-size-fits-none offering. And he looked at it through the lens of jobs. He's a friend of Clay's, actually went to a workshop with Clay, and came away enamored of this idea of jobs to be done, and thought about the population that they were trying to serve through that lens. And he realized that, in fact, there were two very different constituencies with very different jobs to be done. The first is what you might call the traditional student right out of high school, not a lot of distractions, not a lot of life experience, and they're really looking to have what he called the coming-of-age experience. He noticed that when they would come and go on tours, they would talk a lot about financial aid. The university would talk about financial aid. They'd talk about the great education, great job opportunities, but the questions these students would ask were about the sports teams. They were about the living experience. They were about whether there was a rock climbing wall. It was all about, and those were clues that they had a job to be done, which was really about that on-campus experience and all the personal growth they would have. There was another population that they'd been trying to target with an online offering, and these were people that are further on in life, have responsibilities, problems, maybe financial constraints, have families, and they've had all the coming of age they could possibly handle. And what they were looking for, their job to be done, was really about improving their professional prospects, just moving forward in their career. And the nature of the progress that they therefore wanted to have was radically different in those two different populations. For the traditional students, it was all about the social experiences. They wanted to feel part of an institution. For the other folks, it was all about flexibility, speed, efficiency, and building it around all of the unpredictable problems of my life. Very different definitions of what quality means. Traditional students are evaluating things based on, do they have a good sports team or a decent one? For the later in life learner, it's all about convenience, customer service, credentials, et cetera. And so the solution they developed for the new customer set, which is the later in life learners, was this highly personalized, high-touch, end-to-end experience that perfectly addressed the more complex needs that they had. And I won't go into all the details about how they did that. But what I do want to say is, how did they institutionalize the ability to respond to those customer jobs initially and then on an ongoing basis? And Paul is very thoughtful and methodical about how he went about this. The first thing is that they thought about their strategic direction through the lens of jobs, and they moved from this kind of one-size-fits-none perspective on their solutions and a solutions-oriented perspective to this idea that we're going to play in these two distinct segments defined by the jobs to be done, and that the way we're going to win is by creating the experiences that are going to perfectly satisfy those jobs. He designed a whole range of organizational enablers to make this happen. The most important one was that he took that new business and separated it completely off from the core business of serving the traditional students. And then they went through a very detailed process design process in order to develop all the experiences they needed to deliver against those jobs. They're maniacal about metrics and tracking things specifically related to delivering against these jobs to be done. If you walk around SNHU, you'll see these TV monitors everywhere where they literally are in real time plotting and refreshing every second how they're performing on these jobs-oriented metrics, so everybody's aware of them and can see how they're doing and how important they are, which leads to this last set of enablers, which is all around culture and how leaders talk and act. They've framed the mission of SNHU through the lens of jobs to be done. Paul has made sure that every single person working there can repeat it and has internalized it. And they've embraced it to such a degree that they're all empowered to make decisions in the frontline roles through the lens of, is this going to help deliver against the job to be done, or is it not? So it's really a kind of system-level solution to creating this idea of a jobs-focused organization. This is a chart that only a consultant could love, but it has, in more detail, how to think about, the system elements of enabling a kind of customer-centric organization. And again, they fall into these categories of strategy, organization, systems, and culture and leadership. And you can read about them at your leisure. So just to conclude, the three things then that I would repeat for you as leaders in market research functions, if you're trying to truly have a voice at the executive table and give customers a voice, it's about teaching the leaders how to think about the business they're in with the right frame of reference, establishing a common language with which you can communicate with leaders, and everyone in the leaders in the organization can communicate so they can understand and articulate the types of insights you want to share about customers. And then finally, there's a whole range of things you can do to enable what we call a jobs-focused organization. Thank you.